Welcome back, everyone, to the Property Journey podcast, episode 43.
Afternoon, Chris.
We're heading towards the big 5-0, Roy.
Big 5-0.
So we are.
We're going to have a celebration.
What is that? That's a big half century, so it is. I know it's hard to believe, but there's probably nearly, 2.5 years now that we've launched this. I'd say we're heading towards it, like, so. Episode 43, I have picked the title of What Makes a Good Rental Property. So I've a couple of short questions. I'm not going into too much detail today, but I've a couple of short questions just to kind of give people an idea of what a good rental property kind of is, the different aspects that are brought in then sort of in towards that. So I suppose probably the first thing is what the definition of a good rental property is.
Well, before I get into that, maybe it's always good to think about a property that you're going to rent out as a product, and you're the supplier and you've got your client. You always hear some people talking about, sure, a tenant's going to live in it, or sure, you can't see it from my house, is a phrase I've heard recently. But at the end of the day, you're providing a service and you've got a client coming in. So generally, the better the product, the better the client. And at the end of the day, you want your house looked after. Yeah. You've invested a lot of money. You've worked hard for that savings, so you want it well looked after. So what makes a good rental is effectively, in simple terms, something that you would live in yourself. So that means clean, modern, and practical. Simple.
I suppose when you kind of say it like that, it's, if your house is a slum, it'll be treated like a slum. Yeah. And it, obviously we'd be advocates of making sure that rental property are all up to, standard. That's just basic. That should be across the board. But as you say there, if you're not treating that property the way that it should be, any tenant or any client that is going into that property will not treat it with any more respect. If you've got a nice clean product, as you say there, it's clean, it's modern, it's something that most people or anyone should really be able to go and live in. It will be treated with respect, and therefore you shouldn't have too many issues with it.
Before any new tenant moves in, you should either fully clean the house yourself or get a professional cleaner in. And you can simply say to the tenant then, look, you've got a good product here and it's been cleaned. That's the way you want it left. Now, as to whether they leave it like that, that's a different story, but you certainly have that argument, and you're certainly setting the precedent initially that this is how the house is, and all being well, the tenant will think to themselves, right, well, I'll be respectful, I've got a good product here, and I'll leave it clean, or I'll look after it. Yeah,
because a lot of people there are, I suppose the arguments here as well is what is a good rental property. We're talking probably about the standard of it, the actual product itself. Some people then would also look at it from a perspective of, a good rental property is one that's obviously going to be generating income as well. Do you have to kind of look at that from both aspects at the same time?
You get the balance between the two. So I've come across investors who maybe buy a cheap property, they know it'll rent well, but it's not in good condition. That might be all well and good, but you could have a higher turnover, and then ultimately what you're doing is the property's not getting looked after. So very quickly the house is going to deteriorate, and then at some point down the line you're going to have to bite the bullet, and then you're going to have to spend tens of thousands to bring it back up to scratch again. Whereas if you keep that the property or the product in good condition the whole way through your ownership, so that means when a tenant moves out, if it needs a lick of paint or if it needs new carpets or what have you, you've always got a good product, it's presentable, it's holding its value, it'll rent well, and if it rents well, then yes, you get a good return on your investment.
I suppose it's kind of looking at it where, you put a kitchen in, for example, you don't look after it, you might only get 10 years out of it. If you do look after it, you might get 15 or 20 years out of it. We know the prices of, say, for example, kitchens at the moment, you could be in the 10 grand easy. So do you want to be putting 10 grand out in 10 years time, or would you rather your 10 grand lasted 20 years? It's trying to obviously figure that out and making sure.
And it's the quality. It's the quality of what you're putting in. At the minute I'm refurbing a house, and we're getting the bathroom sorted out, so there's there's always one provider I go to that just does a full refit of everything. Comes in, strips tiles, does everything. And ironically, I don't want to spend a lot of money on it, but there are basics that it has to be done to. And there's a few extra things that have to be done in the bathroom that ideally I probably don't want to, but it comes back to what I've said. I know I want it to be a good product, and by spending that money now, I'll get that bit longer out of it.
Yeah. That's kind of obviously then a good definition of it. What then, or how important is the location when it comes to obviously a good rental property? And is there any sort of specific factors around location that investors should be looking at?
Whenever you buy, you should always look at location. At the minute, the way the market is, it is very strong that generally location maybe isn't as important because there's a shortage and a lot of people will just live anywhere because they need a house. But I always look at these things because I come through the last deep recession, and I can always remember smaller towns, smaller villages at that time were very, very difficult to rent out, simply because they had less commuters, there was less public transport, whereas in the bigger towns you had plenty of buses, plenty of jobs and industry. Mm-hmm. So the likes of all those bigger towns locally, they will always rent. So if you have a property in those towns and it's close to schools and it's in a fairly quiet-ish area, it'll rent all day long, no matter what the market. So it's always good to prepare yourself for a very strong market and a very weak market as well.
And I think you've mentioned there about, obviously the likes of the smaller villages and things like that there. We've obviously noticed that, a fairly massive boom when it comes to small villages kind of beginning to expand out with new developments and things like that there as well. Obviously, as that happens, more people are probably enticed into those areas. So is it worthwhile looking at those for potential, or as you said, just trying to keep a kind of more balanced portfolio as such?
Well, for me, I always just look at the big towns, and just simply because I was, traumatized, if you want to use the word, because I can remember there's one particular wee hamlet, and there's no shops, no nothing in it, and I can remember renting a house there back in maybe 2012, and you were basically trying to drag people off the street in to rent it. And every time you were doing a viewing for the rental, it was nearly like a sales pitch where you were begging the person to rent it. So I think because I've come through that experience, my mindset is completely shifted, whereas big towns, plenty of work, plenty of industry, there should always be a good supply of tenants.
Again then, kind of, I suppose, similar-ish question, but what types then of the property, is best for rental demand? We've obviously just said there rental demand is quite strong at the minute. So, are you looking at 2-bed, 3-bed, 4-bed, detached, semi-detached? At the minute, probably it really doesn't matter what it is.
I would say at the minute it doesn't matter because the rental market is so strong in that there's a shortage. I suppose for me, you can never really go wrong with the 3-bedroom because that nearly covers everything. Because if it's a large enough 3-bedroom, well, ideally maybe somebody who wants 4 bedrooms that could get squeezed in to a 3-bedroom, and then likewise, if there's not many 2-bedrooms out there, well, somebody will then rent a 3-bedroom. But the vast majority of properties that you would find outside of Belfast or those major towns and cities, the vast majority of properties would be a 3-bedroom. Yeah.
And I suppose probably again then you're looking at that semi-detached, detached, terraced, there's going to be strong demand probably across the board for any of those types of properties. Is it then kind of where the price point comes in that might affect kind of what people are choosing then?
Sometimes the likes of a 4-bedroom, it can be quite difficult to get the figures to stack up, because for 4-bedroom, generally you're maybe into the very big houses, the detached houses and the relatively fresh houses. So they're very expensive to buy, and therefore to get a rent to stack up for you, it can be quite difficult. So, and then generally if you're renting a 4-bedroom house as well, understandably, there's more people in the house, so it's going to take a bit more. On average, it should take a wee bit more wear and tear. So your changeover costs are going to be higher. So it can be quite difficult to get the figures to stack up for the likes of a 4-bedroom.
Yeah, because what each chatting potentially, and this me randomly sort of throwing out figures, but you could be into what, £1,400, £1,600 a month.
I would, yes, if you're thinking some of the new developments, you're looking at high 200s to buy in the first place.
Yeah,
depending if it has a garage or what have you. And yes, rent you could be looking 1,300-1,400, of which could be slow to get, could be difficult. Yes, there might be a shortage of 4-bedrooms and some people want 4-bedrooms, but the rent has risen that much recently. It could be difficult to get somebody who could afford that.
Yeah,
because if in theory, if they're able to afford that level of rent, they could buy, which is an argument people say. Understandably, to buy you need a big deposit, but there are other avenues where they could get cornership or what have you that we've looked at before.
Yeah. And because I suppose that always is the argument. A lot of people do say, why are you renting when you could just buy? Again, the argument is some people do not want to be tied down to a 25 or 30-year mortgage or whatever the term is. I suppose then when it comes to what is a good rental property, how then could investors kind of match tenants to the certain properties, or obviously if they're doing it themselves, what way does that work then?
Well, I suppose going back to whether it's a 2, 3 or 4-bedroom, you have to look at the particular area, and then likewise the likes of a 2-bedroom, you're generally only ever going to attract a single person or a couple.
Yeah.
So you have to look at the particular area and is there that type of person there? Because if you're buying a 2-bedroom and there's no demand for those smallish houses and there's maybe big families or what have you, then it's effectively it's no good to you. So in fact, pick what market that you want, what location, and then you're getting the right house to marry up with it. Yeah.
And I suppose probably what sort of type of tenant that you want to be able to manage as well, because for some people probably maybe managing, as you said there, a big home that maybe has a big family in it, with the wear and tear and that side of things, they don't want the hassle of it, or they're maybe wanting, as you said, a 2-bed there with a couple on it where there's no issues, and the couple's probably just paying the rent, and that's about the height of what they hear from them. So as you say, thinking about what you want then and matching that then with what rental property that you want to be able to invest in. What then, when it boils down to obviously purchasing the property, what should investors be looking at in terms of those, sort of financial metrics then of, is it what sort of rent it could generate, what the rent maybe is in that local area, what kind of, demand is there, those financial side of things, what should they be looking at?
I suppose maybe in no particular order, but yes, you're looking at, is there a demand in this area? Because if there's not, there's no point buying it in the first place. You're then looking at, well, how much rent can I get? So you're maybe looking at what other houses are there for rent in that area. And if there's a lot of houses, sometimes that can be a wee bit dangerous, because it can look as if, nobody wants to live in that area, so you could struggle to get it rented out. And then you're looking at the cost of buying the house, because again, you want to get a good return on it. Some people get carried away thinking, well, if I get into a bidding war and they bid it up, then it costs that bit more, and then they think, oh, well, sure, I'll just charge more for the rent. It doesn't always work like that. The two have to go hand in hand. So you have to be prepared. Whatever you pay for it, that's that, and you're only going to get a set amount of rent for it. The only way to maximise that rent, maybe push it on a wee bit more, is to have a better product than the house down the street that's up for rent. And you have to be very constructively critical of yourself.
Yeah.
It's all this, people say, oh, well, the house down the street's up for rent. But take a look at it, and everyone's always going to think that their house is better, regardless. But give the two photos, for instance, to a friend and say, right, I'm not telling you which one I own.
Yeah.
Tell me which house would you prefer.
Yeah.
And that's the honest way of getting a response. So if the house down the street is up for so much, well then just tell yourself that your house is worth less, because you're just being too protective of your own house.
It's wee things, but there, as you mentioned, like, you know, gardens maybe slightly smaller, driveway maybe only fits one car rather than two into it. You know, someone could be sitting with a work van, for example, and needs to be able to fit 2 or 3 cars in, and the driveway only fits one, and they're parking on curbs, and, you know, that side of things. Like, you know, you never think about those situations when people are thinking about what they're going to either rent.
And it could also come down to as simple as colour scheme in the house. So, like, to give you an example, your house might be the good old magnolia that was well known years and years ago, but yet the house down the street might have, you know, the greens and the greys and the blues.
Yeah.
Likewise, you know, your skirting and your doors, yours might be the oak or the pine whenever it was built 25 years ago, but the one down the road is all painted modern colours. Like black seems to be the new one now as well.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, the likes of that, something quite small, but it can make all the difference in how much rent you can get and also how quickly it can rent out.
Yeah. And that's definitely, you know, that's not even taking into consideration purchase price or, you know, that side of things in terms of what you're actually going to physically pay for the property as well. So there's a lot more to it, and I think we've had this discussion before. When you're buying a rental property, never mind buying a good rental property, but there's so much more to it than just, I'm going to buy this house and I'm going to rent it out.
Yeah.
What costs then are kind of commonly overlooked? Would it be refurb? Would it be the likes of your legal costs? Would it be, you know, other, you know, sort of costs outside of that people might not sort of think of?
Some costs would be, a lot of people overlook the compliance that you have to have in place now.
Yeah.
So yes, you could be bidding on a house or buying a house to rent out, but that house is being used at the minute by an owner-occupier. So that means you have to bring it up to scratch for compliance. So that means you have to pay for your smoke alarms, get your electrical certificate. So that you could easily be hit with maybe £1,000 or more. Likewise, the boiler. You know, again, you know, a boiler. You could have a boiler running in a house for years and it runs smoothly, and it's sod's law. Then the house sits empty maybe for a few weeks, and then the next thing you buy the house and the whole thing stops. It's just, life is set like that.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you need a new boiler, which could be a couple of grand. So it's just all those wee small things as well that you have to just budget or factor in. And then likewise, a big one which a lot of people overlook is whenever you're viewing a house and somebody's living in it, you know, it can look lovely, all the furniture and everything in it and pictures on the walls. But as soon as you take that all out, you can then see the marks on the carpets where the furniture was and the marks on the walls. So what looks brilliant whenever you viewed it and in the photos, it's a different ball game, and you're maybe then into changing carpets and repainting.
I always say good luck trying to get the Hoover, you know, trying to get the marks out of the carpets.
It's never going to work.
It's, you know,
never going to work.
It's not going to happen. I suppose this is maybe down to personal preference for someone that's thinking about purchasing a good rental property. But is it better to purchase a turnkey? Is it better to purchase a house that maybe just needs a freshen up? Or is it better to purchase a house that needs a full gut job?
Comes down to the personal opinion of the person buying it as to what their view is. Now, some people getting into property for the first time seem to get overexcited by watching all these programs and they want to get stuck into it.
Homes under the hammer.
And on the likes of it. And I would nearly say don't be doing that.
Yeah.
Because you're buying something that, you know, you're immediately not making money on straight away. You're getting into something that you know nothing about. My personal opinion is probably speed more than anything, and that is get a house bought, preferably have a tenant in it or have a tenant lined up so that as soon as you buy it, it's making you money straight away.
Yeah.
Now, that's my opinion on it. Yes, you know, it could be good to buy a house below value and you fix it up and what have you, but that's perfectly fine if you have the knowledge, you have the skill set and you've got the time for doing it. But basically, as a hands-off investor, probably best just to get one that's ready to go. Now, you'd mentioned there about a turnkey. That's a completely different viewpoint. That would be at the higher end of the investment market. Some investors do like that because the view is, yes, the figures maybe don't stack up the same, but in theory, that house will rent like in a click, and you should get a really good tenant, and there's a strong possibility that that tenant could stay there on average for about 5+ years.
Yeah.
So any houses that we've rented that have been brand new, tenants would stay easily. I would say if I went through it, it would be 6+ years, whereas on average any other house probably about 2 to 3.
And I suppose then you're also playing on the option of your turnkey shouldn't be throwing too many problems up either.
Yes, you've got no decoration, you've no worries about revamping. Your boiler will last you many years, and less maintenance and less heartache. And then the flip side to it is, yes, your figures mightn't stack up on a monthly basis and an annual basis, but where you could see the benefit would be the value in the house will on average should rise higher than a typical a former council house or housing executive house or townhouse.
Yeah. I suppose then something that we talk about in most episodes whenever we're discussing rental properties and investment and things like that, obviously what are the biggest risks in rental property investing? I suppose we're looking at the fact that it's big chunks of money that's floating about whenever it comes to property in general.
Risk, I would say, probably maybe something wrong with the house. So give you some examples where I've come across over the years where a survey hasn't been done, and effectively it means that the buyer has bought a house when the seller knew, well, you know what, the roof is maybe a wee bit, maybe needs re-roofed, or there needs to be money spent on that, which effectively they've handed the problem over. It's still legally fine. They haven't, been unlawful in any way. It's just they know that the house needs an investment in some shape or form, and that
could like ridge tiles and things like that.
Even like there's one development, for instance, in Portadown that it's well known that the tiles are now that old that they're becoming very brittle, and that basically every time there's a storm you're losing 10 to 12 tiles. So that's telling you, but that's again knowing the knowledge and knowing the local, having local experience of it. So it's probably the biggest risk is just unfortunately coming into a house that needs investment that you're not fully aware of. And that could maybe be the sewers, connecting to the sewers could be troublesome. As I said, the roof, maybe the trusses are a bit old and they're starting to rot a wee bit. Maybe there's a troublesome shower that's been leaking that on the surface looks okay, but behind the scenes maybe the rafters are rotted, the electrics, the boiler, and maybe even down to the neighbours, difficult neighbours.
And it's just kind of while we're on, I suppose the next question will probably cover this in terms of like legal requirements and regulations and things like that there. What kind of then are the biggest compliance risks now then?
Biggest compliance is just what's come in recently or in the last couple of years. So you've got your smoke alarms all have to be installed. So in very simple terms, they have to be sealed batteries. So that means there's no option of pulling out the square batteries, and they have to be sealed for 10 years. And that if one alarm goes off, the whole house goes off. You have to have carbon monoxide alarms and heat detectors. Then you also have to have your electrics up to scratch. So that means you have to have a certificate to say that they are up to standard. So that can be quite costly. Other compliance, the very basics would be you always have to have your tenancy agreement in place, your deposit registered with a scheme. And then it's always good practice as well for a new tenant to have a check-in condition report as well, so that if there's ever any disputes, you can say, well, here's a report you signed off on. This is how you received the property. So clearly you've damaged this or you've broken this, and this is what I want repaid for. I
suppose then going back to what you've just said there, then I suppose one of the big risks is making sure, as you say, go and getting a survey done for the likes of your electrics and
Mm-hmm.
things like that there, because if they're not up to scratch, you could be looking at a full rewire potentially.
Depending on the age of the house and the condition of the house, you could be into a full rewire, which does be costly and it's really very inconvenient because it's quite messy.
Yeah.
And how it has to be done, and it's pulling the house apart basically.
Yeah. Carpets are up and everything.
Yeah.
You know. And I suppose what would be the one mistake that often turns, good deals into bad deals?
Good question. Probably just not getting the figures stacked up correctly, and maybe not having it verified. So yes, on the one hand, maybe you've done a wee bit of research yourself and you think, well, there's one that's rented, there's one for rent in that area, and it's up for that amount. But it could be an area that you know nothing about, and it could be antisocial behaviour, or it could just be difficult, and it then means that it won't rent.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think of one in Belfast that deals with at the minute, and on paper, it looks really bad. Sorry, basically, on paper it looks really good, and this is where I only ever approach areas and markets that I know. So I mentioned this to the owner, and I says, my goodness, that's in an area there, you're not looking too much for it, and the rent seems to be good. That looks like a brilliant one. And he then told me that he's had nothing but difficult tenants, break-ins, neighbours just loitering about, burglaries, paramilitaries, gangs. He's basically everything, and he wants rid of it. But clearly, if somebody was just doing basic research, they would think that would be a clinker.
Yeah. Doing your research, I suppose, probably then would be boiling down to it.
And have it verified.
Yeah.
By somebody who knows.
That's all, Roy, for what makes a good rental property. So thank you very much for your answers, as always. Thank you very much, folks, for tuning in. That's all we got time for in episode 43, and we'll be back shortly for the next episode.
And just before we finish, we can see every time we do a podcast, the statistics are going up and up. Everybody's listening, but we just need more people to follow and subscribe, because they're missing out on it and they're manually checking it. Whereas if you subscribe, you'll immediately be notified once we upload it. So
yeah, definitely. And as well, we always say that if you know someone that's interested in it as well, forward it on. Let them know where we are, and let them get a listen and see what they think.
Thank you.